Concentration, and please switch off your cell phones. Good. Now we are dealing today, the third lecture, with Schucken's collection of Matisse and Picasso. And as I mentioned at the end of yesterday, he collected 38 Matisses and 50 Picassos. And it has been estimated, in fact, that his collection, Schucken's collection, if it was sold today, would realize at least $100 billion. Not that he would be around to benefit from it, but here we're beginning with Matisse. Now, Matisse was a friend of the artist whose portrait is seen here. This is a portrait of Matisse by Dryad. And Dryad and Matisse meet at an art course in Paris in 1898. And they remain very, very good friends. And in 1905, which is the year this is painted, and it would be painted together with, when he was staying with Matisse, in 1905, the Matisse family, Matisse was married, he had 3 children, and they went to a tiny little village on the coast leading towards the Spanish border. So it would be on the Mediterranean. Probably today it's full of high-rise blocks and all sorts of horrid things. But in those days it was a little idyllic village, away from everywhere, just the sort of thing that Matisse enjoyed. And he had a really blissful few months there. And one of the guests staying was his friend Dryad. And Dryad paints this portrait in 1905. This is the year we're talking about, and this painting is in the Tate Gallery, and it was never, ever in the collection of Schucken. Now, Matisse has been described as well-read, well-educated, and well-mannered. He was a charming man. If you met him, he wasn't eccentric, he wasn't difficult, he was very, very pleasant to meet. But he was a man full of complexes inside, and he was always desperately trying to find and search for the solution to his art. And of course, he does become, together with Picasso, and you can go on arguing it forever, the greatest artist of his period. And Picasso realized this, and they were always, they knew each other well, but they always were, and they're different age groups, but Matisse and Picasso always realized that it was a 2-horse race. And in fact, they enter the finish at the end, but it's a similar time. Now, here is Dryad in a painting painting purchased by Schucken, and it is of a port. That's all the name we have, and I don't think anyone has identified this town. It looks a little too large and too grand for the town where Dryad was staying with Matisse. The town which they were staying in, the little fishing village, was called Collioure, Collioure, and this is, however, a very good example of the art that the 2 men, Dryad and Matisse, were creating at this time. And in the autumn salon of 1905, this painting, together with paintings by, and other paintings by Dryad, and together with paintings by Matisse, were exhibited in the autumn salon. And they evoked some positive comment, but there was one critic who said they were like wild animals. They were bright colors, and they had this sort of image of being dominant and powerful, and so on. And the term used was les fauves. And this is we still use that expression today. It's the Fauvist movement. And they were searching for a sense of 2-dimensional, colorful ornamentation. And this is what they're doing here in this image. Now, in that same exhibition, in the autumn exhibition of 1905, this is exhibited by Matisse. It evoked enormous criticism. There were shouts of condemnation. Excuse me. And it's called Le Bonheur de Vivre, which means the joy of life, or the joy of living. And it actually is a sort of memento of the holiday, or the time, it wasn't exactly a holiday, of the time he had spent in the little village of Collioure. And that archway there, which you see sort of creating an exit towards the sea, is, in fact, a realistic feature of Collioure. The figures are all nude, but that's not a problem on a French beach. You could very often find nudist beaches. But what is important is that you find this group of people who are dancing on the sand. And that will come into our discussions in a few moments. Now, Matisse was exhibiting this to great criticism, and Shukin was at this exhibition, the Autumn Salon. And he saw this painting. It's a big painting. You can see it's over 2 meters across and nearly 2 meters high. And he saw this painting and instantly got that shock that he always reacted when he saw a painting he had to buy. So he rushes to the sales desk and says, "I want to buy that painting," despite all the furor behind him. And the man says, "No, terribly sorry, it's sold already." And he was furious, and he hadn't sort of been crossed like that before. And so he discovers who bought it, and it was Leo Stein. And Leo Stein was the brother of Gertrude Stein, and she is on the top left. Gertrude Stein is a very, very famous figure in the art world of Paris at this time. And she, with her brother, were patronizing Matisse in 1905. Eventually, they will actually move away from Matisse and patronize Picasso, and Picasso becomes a very, very good friend of Gertrude Stein's. But that is beside the point. At the moment, she was patronizing, and so was her brother, patronizing Matisse. And Gertrude Stein, together with Leo, will give these soirees where artists, critics, collectors will come and meet each other, and it is in her environment that Picasso and Matisse will congregate. They knew each other. And it is Matisse, eventually, who will introduce Picasso to Shukin, which is a very, very honorable and unusual thing to do. I mean, he was introducing Shukin to one of his rivals, basically. And it shows what a nice man Matisse was, really. Now, Matisse then says to Vollard, the dealer, "Look, I must meet this man who's painted the Le Bonheur de Vivre. I must meet this man." And so he gets an introduction to go to Matisse's studio. And the first painting he acquires is this one. It's called Crockery on a Table, and it's in the Hermitage Museum. And he doesn't actually buy it outright. This is so typical Shukin. He thinks it's very cerebral. He's got to get used to a painter. He's got to get used to his paintings. He's got to somehow find that inner meaning within the work. And he says to him, and I've written it down at the bottom, "If I find I can stand it," that's the painting, "if I find I can stand it, and if it still interests me, I'll keep it." And Matisse apparently was on record as saying, "Well, I'm very glad he undertook that first dramatic step." I personally, I don't know about you, but I personally would not have been interested in Matisse with this particular painting. But I don't know what, and nobody knows, what this huge reddy-brown splodge is in the foreground. I mean, is it the tabletop? Is it a bit of wood? We haven't a clue. But anyway, it obviously didn't worry Matisse. I didn't worry Shukin. And here we can see it in the Matisse Room in the Trubetskoy Palace. Now, the hang of the Matisses in the Trubetskoy Palace is actually organized through the artist himself. Matisse will go to Moscow at the invitation of Shukin. This is once they've met and once there's a huge relationship between them. And Matisse will go to Moscow in 1911. He is lionized. Every person throws his house open to them. Museums are thrilled to meet him. The public is fascinated, and he's huge publicity in the press. And he stays in Moscow for about two or 3 weeks. And he then organizes the hanging of his own paintings in Shukin's mansion. And you can see here, that is the painting I've just shown you, Crockery on a Table. And then the next painting he buys is that one down below, the blue and white one in the corner. And this is 1908 to 9. Now, we know about this, the history of this, because Matisse records that at one stage he was on a bus, probably a bus like we saw in the Pissarro paintings I showed you, where these figures are getting onto this open-air bus with the horse-drawn carriage, horse-drawn bus. And he went past, he was going down the boulevard, he passed a junk shop, and in the junk shop window was a piece of material. It was a toile de Jouy, and a typical French piece of material. And he saw this, and he instantly reacted to it. He absolutely adored it. He rushed back eventually to buy it, and it remained his most treasured possession for a long time. And here you can see the influence. He isn't copying the toile de Jouy at this point. He's just copying the whole sort of series of lines and colours on the white, the blue on the white. And with the same coffee pot, by the way, that he painted in the previous painting. Now, this will lead to a commission, the first commission from Shukin for a painting by Matisse. And they will become increasingly sort of a team together. Always patron and artist. They were not friends. The patron has got the money and he's going to dictate. The artist has got to do what the patron says. It's extraordinary. There was a very clear division, as there was in all societies in the 19th century. And anyway, this painting, which is a typical Matisse of the time, where he's searching to have this sense of colour, this sense of flat ornamentation, and moving away from the three-dimensionality of the past. And the commission is to paint what is called a harmony in blue. And you get instead a harmony in red. Now, apparently, again, it shows the sort of stages by which Shukin will enter somebody's collection, or will acquire somebody's paintings for his collection. The painting originally started off as a harmony in blue. It was seen and sort of given the okay by Vollard, because letters would go back and forth, of course, from Paris to Moscow. It's given the okay by Vollard. When he sees it as a blue painting, it's then photographed, and the photograph is sent, well, it's a black and white photograph in those days, but it's sent to Moscow. And then suddenly Matisse decides that actually blue is not the right colour, it's going to be red. And Shukin accepts it. Now, the critics of the time said, oh, that's typical of a rich Russian Muscovite who has no idea what he's buying. Totally untrue. Shukin was a textile man. He made his fortune out of textiles. In textiles, you have colorways. You have a design which has a blue background, a red background, a yellow background, an orange background. And therefore, Shukin understood that Matisse wanted a red background. And it is, of course, one of his most famous paintings in the entire world. And this extraordinary flatness, it's painted in his studio in Paris. The Matisse family at that stage was living in an apartment which they were renting from a religious organization. And so therefore that window, that's an opening on the left where you look out onto the actual monastery garden. And it's flat, but it's a picture within a picture. And then the wall, this raspberry red, will then merge into the table and then carry on downwards. And what, of course, again shows the perfection of this is that it is in French called la dessert because a maid is bringing in a bowl of obviously biscuits and chocolates or something. She's placing it on the table. She's in black, her apron is white, and that gives a sort of oomph to the whole scene. Otherwise, it would just be too much red or too much blue. But it is an extraordinarily fine painting, and it shows exactly what Matisse was aiming at in his career now by moving towards the 1910s, 1920s. And here we can see the painting itself. It's a good idea to see this because you get an idea of its size compared to the figure looking at it. This was displayed in the famous exhibition, it really is famous, of the Louis Vuitton Gallery in Paris. Took place in 2016, 2017. It was the most popular exhibition ever mounted in the entire history of art in Paris. It was the display of virtually all Schucken's collection. And the gallery somehow, goodness knows how, did so. Well, Arnaud, who owns Louis Vuitton, is obviously a very, very powerful man, and he obviously pulled a lot of strings. And he had this amazing exhibition. It put Louis Vuitton, the gallery, on its feet, of course, and it was the most huge success. And I must say, to my unending regret, I never went to see it, but still I should have. I've got the catalogue. And so there, the Harmony in Red was painted, as one of the first commissions when there was a correspondence. I'll paint you a blue painting in the manner of, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it turned out to be a red one. And this was the second of the commissions. It's called the Game of Bol. And it's in the Hermitage Museum. Most of the Picassos and most of the Monets, most of the Matisses and most of the Picassos are in the Hermitage. And you can see there these two boys who are playing the Game of Bol, and the third one is, the two boys are his sons, and the third boy is his nephew. And it shows again this reduction of ornament. All you have is colour. That's the grass that they're sitting on. There's the blue of the sea and the sort of hills behind it in the back. Three lines of colour. You don't have to do any more than that. Your imagination is allowed to work in this very simple schematic representation. Now, this will lead on to the greatest commission. The greatest commission, probably not of all time, but because I suppose Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel gets that prize, but it was a hugely important commission. What they decide between the two of them in 1909 is to provide, Matisse will provide two huge paintings to hang on the staircase of his palace. So as you walk up to the first floor, you will pass these two huge paintings, and then as you rise to the first floor, you will then get to the Piano Nobile. And this is a drawing of these two paintings. This is how they looked in the Trubetskoy Palace. And you see ahead of you the dance, and you see on the side there music. There were these two enormous panels, and they were painted to fit exactly into the staircase, and you can get some sort of idea. There are two figures there. That's the last step as you rise up the staircase. And then these two paintings were displayed in the autumn exhibition of 1910. It took Matisse a year. To paint these two, and he, as usual, he will worry over it, he'll think about it, he'll get into terrible turmoil over it, and then eventually he produces these two great works. And they're displayed in the autumn of 1910 in the Autumn Salon. And here's a cartoon showing the dance, and showing there, for instance, on the far right-hand side, a woman who's rushing her children out because they might be infected by this painting, you know, and people throwing their arms in the air and so on, behaving very, very badly. And I mean, why react to such violence to this painting? Anyway, he does. Now, what happens? And this is the dance itself. It's one of the most amazing pieces of art. It again has this simplicity, this sort of shorthand, the way it's five women dancing in a tremendously Bacchic circle. Their movement, they're excited, there's a vibrancy, there's an animation, and there's a joyous thing about it. It relates back to that circle of figures dancing on the sand that I showed you originally, the painting that Schucken wanted to buy and couldn't. The painting which you saw was in the Barnes collection now in Philadelphia. This is the dance. Now, the reaction to this and its companion of music will be enormous. Schucken has a problem. He worries about what his contemporaries will think back in Moscow. These figures are nude. You can't see much, but I mean, they are nude. Anyway, there's enough to shock the conservative priesthood or whatever. And he then, and this is such a perfect example of how there was a huge divide between Shukin and Matisse. Shukin will say she'll say to Matisse, I'm terribly sorry, I've now changed my mind. I'm not going to have the paintings after all. And imagine what Matisse must have thought of. He had moved out of Paris specifically to paint these paintings in a gallery, which was in a studio which was big enough for his canvases to exist. And now they're just rejected. And there was no thought in Shukin's mind, because he was the boss. He was the collector. And what the artist felt was just tough luck. You know, just as if you were an owner of a serf, you couldn't have cared less what the serf thought about. And it was that same divide, which of course shows that we're worlds away. We might be 110 years away, but it's a very different world. Anyway, they're rejected. And Matisse must have been, well, he was in total agony and turmoil. And Shukin gets back on the train. He's going back to Moscow. And suddenly he has a rethink. Suddenly he thinks, because by now he's suffered all these tragedies. He's suffered the death of his wife, he's suffered the suicide of his son, and he himself is in turmoil. And I think he eventually said to himself, look, don't care anything about what other people think, do what you want to do. And this is what he did. And he then sent a telegram en route, traveling in the train over 52 hours. Somewhere they stopped at a railway station in Germany, and he sent a telegram saying, mind totally changed, I want the paintings after all, ship them immediately, which he did. And so everything righted itself. But I think it was a terrible moment for Matisse when these were cancelled. And then, with the exuberance of the dance, this extraordinary vibrancy, as I say, which you have here, you have the peace and calm of music, where again they're all nude, and then it's a lady playing a violin, a man playing the flute, and three singers. Again, on the green grass with the blue sky. That's all you need. You don't have to delineate it any further. And there again, it's the first great examples of modern art. And today they would be, that's why the collection would be so valuable. They would be inestimably valuable if they were sold. Now, these are the commission is 1909, they're hung in 1910. They're hung in December 1910 in the palace in Moscow. Now, there again is the room, the Matisse Room, where, of course, they are the smaller paintings, and there is the game of bowls. Now, Matisse is positioning all these, and it's decided between him and Shukin, because he goes to Moscow in 1911. And it's decided that in 1912, Matisse will go to paint in Tangier to get some more sort of ideas, some more inspiration, some better light and color for his paintings. And he says he'll paint 4 paintings, and they were to be positioned on the wall. You can see that to the left of the Game of Bol, there are 2 paintings. And on the other side, as I'll show you in a moment, there are also 2 paintings. And these 4 paintings were painted following, or at the time of his visit to Tangier. And here you can see the 2 on the left of the Game of Bol. And one is a bow of flowers in a vase, flowers in a blue glass. The flowers and the blue vase are placed upon a piece of material. He always adored materials. He always loved the color and the quality of the textiles. And here you can see what is a piece of toile de Juillet, whether it's the famous one or not, we haven't a clue. It's a bowl of flowers, arums and irises and mimosa. And then on the right-hand side, which is, I think, is one of the most wonderful paintings, it's the goldfish. He somehow presents the goldfish 9 times in his paintings. He obviously has a sort of fascination. Perhaps it's just the movement of the colourful fish in the bowl, whatever. You can see them circulating. They're in a circular bowl, they're on a circular table, and there's a splash of red, and then you have this green growth, which again is, I think, the sort of influence coming from the more exotic Morocco rather than France, because he's in Tangier. Now, the Tangier project was threatened to be an absolute total failure. Matisse, with his wife Amélie, and Amélie is the most amazing support to Matisse, they will go to Tangier in January 1912. Well, I mean, we all know that January in Europe is not really the time to travel unless you're going skiing or something. There are terrible storms. And they get to Tangier, they have booked into a hotel which is squalid and horrid, and they hate it. And Matisse gets in a terribly bad mood. Their room number is number 38. And they have to be incarcerated in this room because the rain just pours down endlessly. The street outside is unmanageable. They can't walk out into the street. It's just flowing with filthy water. You can imagine what it's like. And so they're incarcerated in their bedroom. And apparently the story went eventually amongst this Matisse family. There were 5 of them, Matisse and his wife Amélie, and then the 3 children. And if someone had said, oh, he's suffering from room 38, it means he's in a terrible mood, and he got in a terrible state. But fortunately the weather changed and everything was righted itself. Then in April the couple returned to France, but Matisse will then go back to Tangier in the autumn which is a better time anyway, in the autumn of 1912. So these paintings, 2 on one side of the Game of Bol, 2 on the other, are the paintings which are from his, because the room is waiting, the room has blank spaces waiting for these paintings to arrive. And so there on the right-hand side of the Game of Bol, you can see these 2. One is Arum Lilies, it's a rather impressionistic painting, and then on the far right, is the Morocco in green. Now, I'll come on to the models in a moment, but there you find the influence from Moscow. 1911 is when he went to Moscow. 1911 is when he was fascinated by icon painting, because I don't think he'd ever been exposed to them before. You don't. I mean, there are very few, there were then very few churches of the Orthodox faith. And so therefore, he's fascinated by the icon screens, the iconostasis of a cathedral in a Russian Orthodox church. There's huge series of paintings on the wall, on the division between the priesthood and the congregation. And here you can, it's an Oriental theme, but he has this sort of static pose. The Moroccan is just standing there, rather like one of those big saints on an icon screen. He's looking out towards you, unmoving, still, and so on. And there you have it. But then he also paints, again for this room, and they are in this room, the 2 oblong paintings. One is called Amido the Moroccan. The other is called Zora Standing. And Amido was one of the few people he found who would agree to pose for his paintings. Both male and female were very averse to being painted, and particularly he had no opportunity whatsoever to paint women. The only way an artist could, and it was quite well known, it wasn't just Matisse who realized this, the only way an artist in Morocco could paint a woman was to go to a brothel. And this is exactly, Zora was a prostitute. And obviously perhaps Amido, because Amido became very, very useful to Matisse, particularly when he returned in September 1912. And Zora would stand posing on the rooftop of the brothel. And every now and again there'd be a shout from down below, and Zora would get up and go downstairs. Matisse would wait. She'd reappear again, apparently slightly flushed and eating a biscuit, and then she'd go on standing until she was called again. So it was quite an easy relationship, really. But what is supreme, though, and it's worth all that anxiety and room 38 tedium and so on, is he paints one of his greatest works at this time, which is the Arab Cafe. And it is the most incredible, still, calm, balanced, beautiful painting. He doesn't need to do any more than paint the legs and the faces of the people. It's just this wonderful sense that it's got this calm balance and harmony. It has this, you make up your mind what it's all about. Obviously, it's figures sitting in a cafe, but I mean, it's just the most wonderful painting of a sort of image or sort of skeleton of what the Arab life was like in this cafe. And there you can see it. It's always useful to see these interiors, because there you can get the size of it. There is the Arab Cafe on the board there, and there you get music and dance. Now, in fact, I lifted this from the internet, and this is the new museum in the Hermitage extension that I mentioned yesterday, where some of the buildings of the general staff have been converted into this ready-made, beautiful, air-conditioned, properly lit rooms. But it's taken at quite an angle, because actually the dance and the music are the same size, but the lens has altered the dimension. It looks as if the dance is much bigger, but it's not. Anyway, you see these famous paintings there. And now, if you remember yesterday, I said about the Gauguin room, and that is the entrance on the top left. That is the entrance from the Matisse room into the Gauguin room. And in the Gauguin room, there were those 3 paintings on the end wall. And there were 3 paintings by Matisse, which were placed specifically in the Gauguin room, and their dimensions fitted exactly into the Gauguin room because they were painted for that spot. And again, here you get the middle one. You can just see the figure standing in that painting there, through the doorway. And this is called The Conversation. Again, it's one of his great works. I mean, all these are great. I mean, it's just incredible. You see sort of one famous work after another. And here it's called The Conversation. Now, this is based upon a Roman... No, not at all. It's based upon a stone carving in the Louvre Museum. It's actually a carving of the Assyrian civilization in the modern Middle East. And it's very, very ancient, about 4,000 years old. And it shows a king standing, worshipping or acknowledging the presence of the goddess who's seated. And it is, I think, the most wonderful compliment. Matisse is saying that she is all-powerful. His wife was the most incredible support to him. Unfortunately, towards the end of their life, the marriage fell apart. But for many, many decades, she was his wonderful prop, because he always agonized over everything. And sad, poor man, he was the most chronic insomniac. He couldn't sleep ever. He couldn't sleep well. And for days on end, months on end, she would read to him through the night, so that he could get some sleep eventually. And she was a wonderful, wonderful support to him. And there he is acknowledging that. There he is, as it were, paying his respects to the goddess in her lovely black and green gown. Now, what's funny is that Matisse is wearing pajamas. Now, the pajama as a form of clothing for men came from India. It was part of the British Raj. And it then became very fashionable in France, that people would wear pajamas not in the night, but when they got up in the morning. So that a man, this is only a male thing, but they would get up in the morning and then wear the pajamas until, of course, they changed to go to their club at midday or whatever. But there was a sort of dress that you put on when you got up. And Matisse found this very satisfying because it was loose. He could paint more easily. I think it was a fad that lasted a few years, but it wasn't more than that. But anyway, there he is in his pajamas, paying his respects to this amazing woman who stood behind him, Amélie. And there are the other 2 paintings in the Gauguin room originally. Now, obviously, this painting on the left was painted when the dance was still in his studio, or there would be, perhaps there was a sketch of it, and there you can see the dance, which we see already, and then it's with the nasturtiums in a vase. And on the other side, again, these bright colours, a huge splash of textiles, that blue and yellow textile in the background, and so on. Now, there we can see the Matisses. There are 21 Matisses in this room, and then there are many others in the collection. As I say, there are 38 in all that he purchased. And what was extraordinary, what was tragic actually, is that when the war started in 1914, there were in Matisse's studio 4 Matisses ready to be shipped. But in 1914, the war started. You couldn't travel to France then because you couldn't cross German territory, and also you couldn't transfer money. So the sale never went through. The paintings exist, and they're dotted around museums in the world, but another 3 could have been added, but another 4 rather could have been added. But there you see the paintings, 21 in all. So let's move on now to Picasso. As I said, Matisse introduced Picasso to Shukin, and the first meeting was a bit of a disaster because Picasso was a young man. He was ambitious. He was virtually starving to death. He had no income at all, or very little. And he was living, as I mentioned, with his first great sort of muse, a lady called Fernande Olivier. And Shukin, as usual, is cautious. He doesn't plunge in and buy a whole series of paintings like Morozov used to do. In fact, I think he buys one, or a little drawing or something, and then when he leaves, Picasso and Fernand, these 2 young people in their rather disheveled studio in Montmartre, are furious and very upset. Well, little do they realize that then Picasso is going to put Picasso on the map. But what Shukin does is then, by paintings prior to their meeting, because he meets him in 1906, and he buys up the earlier works of Picasso. So what we'll see first, we'll look at the large painting next to the door there, which is of, naturally, his blue period. Picasso was living at this time in Barcelona. His father was the teacher at the art school. And he then went to Paris on a visit, and as a very naive young boy. And he was fascinated by the life of Paris, and in fact, he always loved low life. He always loved the sort of squalid atmosphere of the city. And he went to a woman's prison called the Saint-Lazare. And he never needs to draw anything. If he sees you as an audience and thinks, oh, I'll paint that tomorrow, he will remember it all in his mind. He doesn't have to draw it down. He doesn't have to sketch it. And he remembers this scene from the Saint-Lazare, where it's called the 2 Sisters, or called the meeting, or called the visitation. We haven't a clue what it is. Picasso never, ever named his paintings. It was up to you to decide what they meant. And you can just imagine these sort of very rich sort of American heiresses saying, oh, Mr. Picasso, please tell me what this means. And he'll say, well, it's up to you to decide. I'm not going to tell you. And in fact, he could get very shirty if people went on about it. So we don't know what he thought it was going to be, but it's always accepted the fact that the woman on the right is one. There are 2 sisters. That one is a nun, and the other, who's bending her head is a prostitute. And it's these big, looming, grand, powerful figures. He was the most incredible draftsman, Picasso. And there he's painting. Why was it a blue period? Well, think up a reason, because I'm not going to tell you. And that's what he said. And he paints in blue. There he paints this scene. It's called The Blind Beggar with a Boy, which is, again, amazingly touching, because there, again, he's got an empathy, he's got a sympathy for it. He's a young man. He feels deeply about these people he sees. And there's a little boy who's shielding against the old man, who obviously, in turn, is reliant on the young boy. And it's got a sense of fragility, that big leg there. It shows the fragility of this whole situation. This is back in Barcelona. This is a beggar on the streets of Barcelona that he would have seen. He has gone to art school, but now he's abandoned that because he knows he's too good. And he then goes on his own. Now, then by 1904, he goes to Paris, but we'll get to that in a minute. And here you can see two others from the blue period. Not that there's much blue in the one, but one on the right is Sabbath, James Sabbath. Sabbath is a friend of Picasso. Picasso was a workaholic. Even from the earliest days, he'll work hour upon hour upon hour. He wants nobody with him, nothing to interrupt him. He wants to work, and he does so. But then he's also a great party figure. He loves going out, always in an entourage of friends, always the leader, always the top man, always with this group of friends, some of whom will become world famous in their own rights. And James Sabbath, is Spanish, of course, and he's looking a bit disconsolate, but only because Picasso obviously is about 2 hours late. They're going to meet in a cafe. When Picasso walks through the door, he sees Sabbath saying, "Oh, for God's sake, how many more miles have I got to wait?" And there, immediately, obviously, Sabbath will get up and we'll have a good chat and they'll have a lovely evening. But he remembers this scene. He remembers what Sabbath looked like when he walked through the door. But in contrast, and Sabbath, to finish it all, Sabbath then goes away. He goes to live in Central America, Spanish-speaking, and makes his living there, comes back with a fortune with his wife, and the two of them by the 1930s will remain as the constant companions of Picasso through to his death in the 1950s. They will be his support. It's a rather lovely thing. But there on the left-hand side is again one of his most early works, which is the Absinthe Drinker, and it's a sense of degradation, it's a sense of isolation, a sense of loss, a sense of being completely alone. He must have seen this again. He wouldn't have drawn it, he just remembers it, and he presents this painting. It's one of his most famous from the blue period, the early period. And the absinthe was a drink, of course, as you know, called the Green Goddess, because apparently it gave you wonderful hallucinations. But I'm sure Picasso tried it. But there he is himself as a young man. Because this is the period we're talking about. There he is in Montmartre, and the building on the right, it's this sort of series of buildings, actually. All this area here was given a name by one of the group surrounding Picasso, of the Bateau Lavoir, which is the most silly name, really, because it means the washing ship or the wash ship. It's neither a ship nor it's got anything to do with washing. But anyway, this was the name given to it, and it has stuck. And that's where Picasso lived, in the studio, from 1904 to 1909. And this is when he was struggling. This is when, of course, he yearned to sell paintings and couldn't, because nobody, and he never exhibited, by the way. He was a very sort of dogmatic man. He never exhibited, but he just waited for word of mouth. Well, if you don't, nobody knows you. I mean, how's the word going to spread, really? But anyway, eventually, as I say, Picasso is introduced to Schuken. And he lived in the Bateau Lavoir, which had no electricity, no running water, no sewage, no heating, nothing at all. And he lived this extraordinary bohemian life and just adored it. And he said many years later it was the only time he was ever happy. It was this young, wonderful sort of joie de vivre which he had. And again, he was working through the night. He always worked at night, and then painting, partying through the day. This is the general trend, anyway. And here you can see, as you move on, out of 1904 is the last of his blue period, and then you move into the sort of what he called the pink period. But there's this wonderful painting of this young woman of Mallorca, a young woman of Mallorca, 1905. It's in the Pushkin. And she's painted again with this extraordinary tenderness, there's also extraordinary ability, and she's wearing this rather strange sort of lampshade of a hat. And it was apparently a typical feature of Mallorca in those days. And then the material going on each side would be tied under the chin. Now, what as I say, we never know why, how Picasso was inspired by. What he painted, he never gave a name to. But again, here on the bottom right, nothing to do with Shukin, but you can see on the very far right, the Mallorcan lady. Sorry, I keep on saying Mallorca. The woman from Mallorca. She seems to be completely isolated there. And the other group of figures on the far right are a family of the Saltimbanque. They're jugglers, they're sort of circus entertainers, and they're all dressed in their costumes. Picasso loved circuses. There was a circus in Montmartre, and he would go as frequently as possible. He just absolutely adored it. And there he pops this Mallorcan lady in the corner there. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful work. Now, we've seen, and the arrows sort of point, we've seen James Sabbath, we've seen the beggar, the old man and the little boy, we've seen the two sisters, and one or two others there. I can't make them out at my angle. We've seen the absinthe drinker. Now, each side of the absinthe drinker is the farmer's wife. Now, this is 1908. And in 1908, Picasso is now being patronized by Shukin. Money, a little money, I mean, he's paying small prices, usually through Kahnweiler, the third dealer I mentioned, sometimes through Vollard. But he then can go on holiday. The first time in his life, and a proper holiday. And he goes off into the countryside in the middle of 1908, in July, August 1908. And they stay, and they rent a room, and their landlady is this lady here. And she's called the farmer's wife. Well, I mean, she wasn't the farmer, she owned a sort of house where she rented out rooms. And there she is, this woman. Now, Picasso was fascinated by her. Picasso was a very short little man. And this was a lady of 6 foot in height, and she weighed 300 pounds. And she was this huge figure. And he followed her around like a little dog. He was fascinated by her. But he was terrified. He didn't dare ask if he could paint her, because she thought to give him a big slap. So he then goes back to his studio, remembering her, and he paints her like she is. I think they're the most fantastic paintings. And what they represent is that Picasso, seamlessly, as you move through the days, as he's working day after day after day, working through the weeks, working through the months, gradually his style changes. But it's sort of seamless. You don't sort of go from one to the other. He doesn't stop one day and say, I'm going to paint something different. It just manages to evolve that way. And this is the genius that he was. But here, he's actually now in his African period. He's influenced by sculpture coming out of West Africa. We know Irma Stern, who bought mainly in the Congo. And I think there would have been certain Congolese statues as well, but mainly they came from Senegal, from the Ivory Coast, from all those French territories around about the west coast of Africa. And there you can see there this sort of block-like simplicity of these figures. He's now creating the simple shape of figures. You can see that he doesn't need to put a mouth in. You know that there's meant to be a mouth. There she is seated. I think the one seated is so good, where the arms are sort of divided into sections. Now you can see that, I hope, here in the next work, which is called the Dryad. All these names are just stuck, but some experts, some art historian gave them these names. As I say, Picasso just churned out everything, and it was up to you to decide what they were like, what they were. And this is called the Dryad, a lady that lived in trees, a nymph that lived in trees. And you can compare that to the statue. It's from Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau was a Portuguese territory. It's in that West African bulge, going from Nigeria around to Senegal. And you can see there the straight shoulders. You've got the straight shoulders. You can see there the arms broken into various pieces. Look at those flippers of the feet. again like the feet of the statue. It's quite clear, and Picasso actually bought, I mean, he was impoverished, but he was always keen on his art, and he bought a couple of statues from West Africa. And he was very, very influenced by them. And there you can see that here. Now, probably his most famous one of this period, this African period, it's sometimes called the Nigra period, which you don't mention anymore. It's called after, the Shukin family called it after the ball, which is actually very clever because it looks as if she's just sunk into the chair. She's forgotten that she's got a bosom exposed and she's just seated there. It's a woman with a fan. That's what the definition is now. And you can see there, as I say, again, the sort of block-like feeling of the cut-off shoulder, the arm ending in the hand, the fan falling down, and it's regarded as the best work of this period. And there you can see the woman with a fan. This again is in one of the galleries in the new wing of the Hermitage in Moscow, in St. Petersburg. There you can see the woman with a fan. That's called Friendship, and that's called a seated woman. And they're all of this period, all 1908 to 1907 to 8. And you can see there again the breaking down of the body into various compartments, like sort of joining a sort of Barbie doll together. But there you can see the one on the right, which I think is a wonderful example. There you can get, she's almost like she's wearing bits of armor. You can sort of, she's put, part of her leg is just a piece of, and which is joined to the other part. And so it's got that sort of breaking down of the surfaces, which eventually will lead seamlessly into Cubism. And he's influenced here quite specifically by African art. But then gradually, as I say, as a month goes by, as a year goes by, so his art, his style changes as he evolves. And this you find here in these works. So it's, the works that Shukin was buying, of course, all stop in 1914. So there's no continuation into the other realms of women with two eyes at the back of their head and things. But here you've got the room itself. You can see the lady with the fan. That painting in the middle is actually three figures on the far right, and it's purchased from Gertrude Stein. She, as I say, was a great, great supporter of Picasso as well. That is, we've seen the Dryad, we've seen these two. And then what we'll show finally is the factory at Tortosa. And I think this is a wonderful continuation, because an artist as great as Picasso, it absorbs the psyche of the time. He was aware, and this is 1909, he's aware by now that in the new century, it's a century of speed, it's a century of machines, it's a century of factories, it's a century of aeroplanes, and so on and so forth. And here you can see a brick factory. It looks like little items from a Monopoly set, but it's the brick factory of Tortosa, and and he's breaking down the surfaces, he's breaking down the sky into various colours, which is relevant and realistic, but there he's presenting a new world for us as it emerges into, well, of course, then the First World War comes, but as it emerges into the 1920s beyond. And he's anticipating that, he's aware of that, and you see that there. Now, naturally, as I say, everything stops from our point of view in 1914. And what happens to these two men is that Morozov, as I've mentioned, will die. He leaves legally. He and his wife and children will leave quite with permission in 1918, and he'll go and live in Germany and die in Karlsbad, as I mentioned. Shukin will flee. Shukin remains too long, and he's too preoccupied. Of course, his collection is his world, and he has to get up and leave it. And eventually, by the middle of 1918, he realizes there's events taking place which eventually will explode where they murder a lot of the surviving aristocracy and so on, and he would have been caught in that trap. He leaves with his son, and they leave with nothing. They leave everything behind. By that stage, which would have been